Let's have prayer. Dear God, we're thankful that we can be here today. We're thankful that we have the privilege of hearing this presentation. We ask that your presence will be with us. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you. I should have mentioned also that she gives a lot of counsel to her housemates, dealing with forum and other topics as well. Now, during the break today, you're going to find at the refreshment counter, there's a little plastic box with a thank you written on the outside. Because the document that you're going to receive today costs over $2 to prepare each, we're going to invite you to make a donation to that, and that's put out there where it'll be convenient for you. You'll get that document to take home with you today. I need to have our forum board members who are here today meet for a short meeting up here at the beginning of the break today. Now with that, Dr. Hoyt, would you come forth? Oh, I should ask one other thing as he's coming up this way. How many of you read the recorder regularly? The Pacific Union Recorder. Did you notice the announcement about today's meeting in the recorder? Some of you did. I found it amazing that under the bulletin board there is an announcement about this meeting today. I'd like to suggest to you that 20 years ago that would not have happened. There's a different attitude in terms of the editorial board at the recorder. They're willing to announce things like plagiarism. All right, Fred, come on up here, would you? And let me grab this one. And let me interrogate you just a little bit. This is not your first meeting with us, is that right?
You told me it's the fourth.
The fourth one,
That's
right.
hard to believe.
Well, it is the fourth one. You've talked to us about John Wesley and his notion on health reform and how he adopted that. You talked with us about mesmerism in Maine and how we coped with that. And you also talked with us about a medical biography of Ellen G. White.
I remember those faintly, yes.
You do. Which of those three would stand out in your mind as being the most fun to research and present?
John Wesley.
John Wesley,
I was so surprised
at
him. A fascinating man. One of my heroes now.
All right, very good.
Great man. And you don't learn that until you get into the writings.
Okay.
You read the original, then you begin to appreciate it.
Okay.
And I must tell this audience here, the last time I met Averill and Jim was in February at La Sierra when they dedicated a special patio in honor of Jim and Averill and their 20 years plus of service to Adventist Forum. It's a beautiful patio as you come up to the administration building, past the beautiful sculpture of the prodigal son. On your left, before you get to the level ground, stop in. It's a very restful, beautiful place for meditation. So I recommend it highly, and they deserve the honor very much. I was asked to say a few words, and I said too many. But one thing I said was that I moved that we name this place right here, this holy ground, the South Graduate Campus of La Sierra University, for what this forum does here. It's really university graduate level work. You don't know it perhaps, but that's what you are. And so they were honored in this way. Okay.
Now you have to thank you. Thank you. They named this the Path of the Just, and I want you to be aware of where he located us, just beyond the prodigal son. There may be more truth in that than we know. Fred, how does a historian go about his research? Do you go to the La Sierra Library and open the card catalog or
No.
periodicals index? What do you do?
To be honest with you on this, I don't know what the inspiration... You start with a question, a problem.
Okay.
How it came to me, I don't know. I would have to think about that. When you start with a problem, a question, you say, what's the answer to this? And no one can give you an answer, so you begin to look. And the farther you go, the more confused you get. Almost always. It's very complex.
Now, does your research require you to travel sometimes to go to a place?
I have been to the state of Maine many times. And it's one of the great bonuses of my research. My specialty is the Philippines. So you see, I travel a little bit.
Okay.
Some people tell me I should have stayed with the Philippines, but that may be a bad joke. We'll see at the end. Don't take a vote on it, though.
One more question for you. When a historian discovers facts, can we consider those to be indisputable, irrefutable, and accurate?
If you read this, I'm sure you have or will, there is one word that historians are horrified when they see it in a book, and that is definitive.
Okay.
There is no such thing written by mankind that is the last word. What the publisher, you know what I'm referring to, what the publisher is intending when they tell you this book is definitive, they don't want you messing around in it anymore. Don't ask anymore. Say, this is it.
Good.
That is foolishness to say anything is ever finished with human beings.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
That's all right. Do you have any current research project on that you want to tell us about?
I will distribute another freebie. This one's really free. Yeah. This one's paid for by the history department at La Sierra. Remember, it's in your will. And it's a smaller one than we're having here now. And it will indicate another project that I have sort of bumped into in doing this one. Okay. And yes, I have several ongoing ones. I'll talk about those later on.
With that, let's welcome Dr. Fred Hoyt, and let's invite Arnie and his crew to start distributing these handout materials.
Now, when do you want me to stop for the break?
When do I want you to stop?
Yeah,
when you finish.
No, but I know I won't finish in time. I'll stop.
We usually go maybe 50 to 60 minutes.
So it's 2:20. I'm at 3:20.
We're at 3:15 now, and go to 4:30.
4:30. Okay.
That's about 60 minutes.
And you wave at me or yell at me if I don't.
Let's welcome Dr. Fred Hoyt. Okay.
And I know this is illegal aboard an airplane, but it's certified to be Arrowhead Springs water. And I'm even shaking it and no bad effects. So wait. Be careful. Careful. You are getting a copy of this entire manuscript. I'm sorry for the size of it. I started out not knowing where it would go, and this is the way it ended up without doing an injustice to any topic. I will not read it. You have a copy, and we'll just look at sections, and I'll say this is important, or I disagree here, or there's some problem, or whatever. So you can read it later on. The warning on the front is a bit of, I hope, a high-level joke. It is. You can copy it all you want to, since it has been copied. It's a little play on words about the ninefold kowtow, and you'll pick that up, I'm sure. Okay. The paper starts out with some very extreme statements. These are there simply to catch somebody's attention that this problem is serious. So I may have overstated it, and I would admit that I probably have. But if they get anybody's attention that I think the problem is extremely serious, then that paragraph has been worthwhile. And the problem, of course, is plagiarism. And I want to make it clear that I'm speaking as a secular historian. And I want to emphasize that I have a degree in religion from the School of Religion at La Sierra. I'm not opposed to that area. But there are certain problems that historians of religion have with dealing with people, and I would be glad to explain that. They're not bad. They are just problems that I don't want to deal with. And so I'm a secular historian for purposes of this paper. And the definitions of plagiarism you can read for yourself. This is a sample of what you're going to read. Now, this is a secular historian's description of a mortal sin. There is no quicker way to end your career in history than to commit plagiarism. Just a simple little bit of plagiarism. I'll get some examples later on. Plagiarism is stealing the words or ideas of others and presenting them as your own. I'm on the second page, in the middle of the page. Done consciously or not. Notice that. Consciously or not. Plagiarism in any form is the same as stealing, punishable in most colleges by immediate failure or even dismissal from school. And that is true in my college and university. So I won't read any more of those. You can see where I got them from. we're dealing with a mortal sin in my area. And I want to keep it strictly understood that I'm talking from that standpoint. Now, we come to a section clear over here on page 5, the implications for Adventism, for Adventists. Notice in that second paragraph, fortunately, some aspects of this problem seemingly have already been satisfactorily resolved. And the one I want to emphasize here is what is called verbal inspiration or automatic writing. This never applied to Ellen White, was never claimed by her. Other religions do make this claim, but not Adventism. She was not God's stenographer, with very rare exceptions when she would say, and the angel said, and would have quotes. So we clear that up. And in the next section I can summarize that, maybe I read one quotation there. Any contention that Ellen White matured as a writer by wide reading and constant practice so that she reached the level of composing at an advanced level without significant assistance cannot be sustained by investigation. So she did improve as a writer. Her taste in good writing improved over her lifetime. But as a writer herself, she never reached that stage where Desire of Ages ended up, and I'll amplify that later on if you don't understand it. There's some other assumptions clear over here on page 6 now. These are personal presuppositions, I call them, and I want these understood. First, Ellen G. White was a divinely called and ordained prophet in the Orthodox Christian tradition. That's my stand. Second, Ellen White was a highly moral, ethical person who would not consciously have distorted the facts or misrepresented the truth about herself and her work. Notice in italics, as she understood them. Nor would she have deliberately engaged in any obfuscatory, duplicitous, or misleading statements concerning them. And then I repeat, the important point, as she understood the truth about herself at any given time. Now down at the bottom of the page, I say doubtless the most crucial assumption is that no further research is needed in order to prove beyond any reasonable doubt that Ellen White consistently, knowingly, and openly functioned, notice the italics, in a manner that today would be termed plagiarism by me, my historian friends. That both she and her supporters harbored some doubts about the legitimacy or the moral correctness of such procedures is strongly suggested by the instant and harsh manner with which questions about such literary dependence were treated. And right there, I need to point out, I will not use the term literary dependence. I'm only using the term, even though you may think it's harsh, plagiarism. This leads to a fundamental overriding question that must be faced, bottom of the page and over to 7. Here we're getting at the heart of the problem. How can we now rationalize, understand, justify, or excuse seemingly unethical conduct by Ellen White and her colleagues related to their misuse of sources? But then I say we have to trace this story from its beginning. There's the problem area. Now, how did we get started in this? What's the history of this? And I will jump rather rapidly through some of these without making more than a point or two. First, a man you may have heard of as the first great heretic among Adventists. I'm not interested in whether he was a heretic or not. This is Elder Kenwright, Elder D.M. Kenwright. I assume he was. Not discussing that. He was the first, according to Fred Veltman, and we'll come to him later on, to cry out publicly that Ellen White was a plagiarizer. And the date, notice it, is 1887. Now we have another man we're going to talk about quite a bit, and that is Francis Nichol, whom many of you should remember as editor of the Review, editor of the commentary series, author of many books, and in my childhood, one of my great heroes, with whom I've come rather disillusioned later on, but that's another problem later. Okay. Francis D. Nichol, the church's masterful apologist of the last century, treated Canwright's charges of plagiarism almost dismissively in his magnum opus. And that magnum opus we'll refer to many times down here in footnote 10, Ellen G. White and her critics. Magnum, right, what is it, about 700 pages, I think. Enormous one. Nichol dealt with Canwright in his carefully constructed defense of Ellen White's research and writing strategy for her extensive writing production that had obviously developed pragmatically, trial and error, over many years. Clearly, he saw his job as a dedicated and skilled apologist, that means defender, for counsel for the defense. The result is a masterpiece of pleading, legal term, written with impressive self-confidence. Okay, I'm willing to admit to that, for this is a marvelous book as not scholarship, apologetics. Keep that in mind. Now, notice that first full paragraph. The major error in Nichol's strategy came from his very limited vision of the church's future, which caused him to win the immediate battle, or so he must have firmly believed, but at a very heavy price. And this is developed on a bit further. He did not realize that he was standing on a watershed, figuratively, for the Adventist church, that the church's fundamental conditions were changing. And I stated in a way that may offend some of you, but here's the way it looks to someone with a little sociology and history background. The elite ministerial leader that he so convincingly represented would soon no longer be able to dominate all church thinking. Why was this so? Because of a crisis at Loma Linda, which wasn't called Loma Linda University then, but the College of Medical Evangelists. Have some of you heard that term? They were told to no longer accept any pre-med student to the School of Medicine unless they came from a fully accredited college. Well, that meant no Adventist school could send pre-med students to Loma Linda. So they had to leave their Bible college status and become fully accredited. What did that mean? A very dangerous maneuver then. People had to be sent off to worldly schools to be educated in various scholarly disciplines. In so doing that, these professors to-be learned the methodology of these scholarly disciplines, how you think, the philosophy, how you do research, how you question. And if I may insert an illustration here, which I think is very meaningful if you follow it. I had a very good friend, fine colleague, who went off to graduate school, got his MA, got his PhD, and I heard the lament of the family. He was a fine man before he went off to graduate school, and now he continually asks questions. That's what they do in graduate school. They continually say, what's the answer? How do you think about it? How do you prove it? He became critical in the best sense, and they thought it was bad. Well, see, that's what we're opening up to by this. So I developed this some more here, and you can read it on your own. Now, I say over on page 9, now these are my opinions, obviously. I don't need to footnote my statements. These are my opinions, my conclusions. By a clever combination of dismissive and reductionist techniques, he, this is Nichol, provided all-encompassing answers in language accessible even to the only moderately educated laity. Here are his defenses, which I found absolutely appalling that a man of intelligence could make these sorts of defenses. Maybe that shows more about me than I should admit. Borrowing without giving credit has been done by all great writers. Therefore, what are you fussing about? Everybody does it. Everybody does it. Everybody steals. Oops, not that. A powerful precedent, you see. Powerful precedent. Then, going on down, chief plagiarists have been religious writers of all things. The worst stealers without credit people have always been religious writers. I'm appalled that he would even make this statement. And he then picks on one of my heroes, John Wesley, and says, John Wesley did it. But notice, John Wesley admitted it and confessed and said, I'll do better. That's the key difference here. John Wesley was just human. Then, surprisingly, Nickel declared that there had always been general agreement among religious leaders and writers that such practices were acceptable because, and now I'm quoting Francis David Nickel, they felt that they were writing not to advance their own interests, that is, religious persons possess no egos, but the interests of the kingdom of God as determined solely by themselves. It's in brackets, those are my words. And that whatever might contribute to that objective, the kingdom of God, could be drawn upon. This is a beautifully phrased example of Jesuitical or Machiavellian thinking. Those are not complimentary terms. This is absolutely appalling that he would use this sort of excuse or reasoning. Notice, I write some more about it. Logically, the argument exempting the religious, that is, the full-time religious professors, those whose vocation was religion, from the generally accepted prohibitions against plagiarism appear both ludicrous and blasphemous. My terms, I admit. Is the degree of moral turpitude stemming from the practice of plagiarism really in inverse proportion to the degree of religiosity in the perpetrator? The more religious you are, the more you can plagiarize. And people like me who can't claim any religiosity, we're fully guilty if we do. This is ridiculous, I think. Lest any doubt remain, dropping down the paragraph, that we're glossing over the literary, notice, I put a sick in there saying, notice that word, literary picture of the past in order to make out a case for Mrs. White, then Nickel firmly stated in an almost unbelievable conclusion, we wish to give one more exhibit from the field of religious writers. And now he picks on poor Canwright. And he said they published a book of his at the Battle Creek Press in 1878 called The Bible from Heaven, and he simply stole the whole book, put his name on it. And he got that from a Moses Hall who stole it from somebody else, put his name on it. There must be something wrong with that story. How could the Adventist press do that? But I think it offers us an insight into the lack of mature thinking about this problem from the very beginning. How could an Adventist press say this is legitimate to print a whole book and put somebody else's name on it and pay him the money for it? Brackets, I've been plagiarized, and I won't take the time to explain it to you. Somebody else got $75 for copying part of an article of mine, and I was indignant for the $75 and also for the theft. And I want justice, and they won't answer me from the... Anyway, it's just an unthinkable sort of thing to do in the writing business. And I go on to lament how this could have happened over here in the next page. I don't know really why he brought it up. It's not clear to me at all. Well, let's jump on over here to the next section. Nickel goes on the attacks here. On page 12 now we are. Nickel now defines the essence of plagiarism. So that's good. So we're not in doubt what he's talking about, what we're thinking about. An attempt of a writer to deceive his readers into thinking that the entire work which bears his name is wholly his own, when in fact some strains were drawn from the fabric of some other author's work. And I should explain to you, and I'm sure you all know it, that when you see the three little dots, the ellipses in there, I have left something out. I don't leave it out to confuse you or to make the meaning change at all. I leave it out because it wasn't germane, irrelevant to what I want to talk about. And I give you the reference so you can look it up to check me. And if I was trying to be tricky with you, give me a phone call. Okay. Note that deception here is the crime. Deception. So now I say his reasoning was straightforward. So here's how he applies it to Mrs. White's writing, particularly great controversy. Clear at the bottom of that page. The problem before us is not whether she borrowed, but how much she borrowed, and whether she borrowed in such a way as to deceive the reader. So those are two fundamental questions he asked. One is, we're going to talk about minimalism. He's going to say, it wasn't much, don't worry about it. It's just a little bit. That's the minimalist defense. The other was she trying to be deceptive? And he says, no, she wasn't. And I'll let you read how he defends this. And my word, and it's my word, is this is absurd. This is absurd. How do you know that, when you read the book today, how do you know what he states here is true or not? You're not familiar with the sources. What do you need to tell you what the sources were? You need what we call a footnote and a bibliography. And it isn't there. It isn't there. So in the future, this becomes a ridiculous defense. Now, I marked to read that whole next paragraph, but I will not read it. And he gives his conclusions here, and you can read this all. All right, we must get through more of this. And let's go clear on over to page 14. And there, no, I better leave that to you to read. You read those when you have time. Got too much with Nickel here. And now he defends something here on page 19. That is her speaking. He says, her writing we have, but the speaking, she had nobody to correct her on correct speaking. And he said, well, he makes these statements, she was a fine speaker. Okay, I'll accept that. I asked him to produce some examples that she was a superlative speaker of good English. I have 3. Some of you have read my article on Beethoven Hall. It was madness, sheer madness in this Millerite meeting. 1987, Spectrum, you can read it. Reported by a competent reporter. The trials of the Damon trials out in Atkinson in Maine. There, sheer madness again. Wild Pentecostal meetings. The third example is a meeting in Battle Creek. That's manuscript 43A, and I have a copy with me if you're interested. That does not illustrate what he claims there. So maybe you say I'm quibbling. Now we come to the Nickel evaluated. These are, and I've just run a line down to read these all to you, so I won't. This is my evaluation of Nickel's arguments here on 20, 21, and 22. Last paragraph, and then we'll move on. On page 22. Elder Francis D. Nickel seemed the man for that time in Adventist history, the great apologist. Unfortunately, neither he nor the church leaders then realized that firm ground his skills had apparently created was slipping rapidly from under their feet because of an unperceived accelerated rate of change, like we talked about. Increase of well-educated Adventists, outstanding scholars. And we are going to talk about next about one who was certainly a marvelously intelligent man. A well-educated man for his time also. You have strong feelings that differ with mine on John Harvey Kellogg, but I'm interested in his attitude towards plagiarism. Here it is, and with citations. And the citations are from a formal document which I have in my possession, was sent to me by someone, I don't know whom, marked on the cover, confidential, not to be distributed. I'm sorry if anybody got in trouble. This interview between Elder G.W. Amadon, A.C. Bordeaux, and Dr. John Harvey Kellogg, Battle Creek, Michigan, October 7, 1907. And here he brings, we better pick up a few statements here right at first. Don't you think that when mother sees, this is Willie making this statement to Kellogg, when she sees things in vision or in print, then later runs across things that agree with what she has seen in vision, that it is all right for her to adopt it? This is Willie, her son, saying, isn't this okay, Miss Dr. Kellogg? Notice Kellogg's response. No, not without what? Giving credit. Giving credit. There's Dr. Kellogg's stand. And he reiterates it all the way through. He then brings up on page 24 what happens with a book called How to Live, printed in 1865 under Ellen White's name. Kellogg, can you find it there, first full paragraph, second one on page 24. Kellogg bluntly declared that a large share of it, that book, was borrowed by Mrs. White from Philosophy of Health by Larkin B. Coles, M.D. And I want you to skip over the page then to run on page 25, one of the most unusual coincidences in my historical research. When a young man, a good friend of mine, whom we were considering to hire at La Sierra, in graduate school at the University of California at Berkeley, named Ron Numbers, ran on to the same book and read his statement. That's what got him started on prophetess of health, which ended with him being thrown out, of course. Well, the end of this is a sad story. John Harvey Kellogg was thrown out of the church, cast out, as they say, without a trial, November 10, 1907. And then tragically, the same thing has followed for Ron Numbers. Now, we come quickly to the next very important event, which may not read like it's very important to you, a group meeting to discuss at the GC headquarters problems related to teaching Bible and history courses. It happens every year. It's happening right now, or just finished back in Nashville, Tennessee. Teachers meet to discuss problems. Here is the meeting called the 1919 Bible Conference. The president of the General Conference was Elder Arthur G. Daniels. During this conference, a number of questions arose about Ellen White's plagiarism, borrowing, and how we should relate to it. At the conclusion of the conference, the conference record was sealed, and Elder Daniels decided not to share it with anybody, not to pursue it any further. So it was, as one person has observed, Mulares Couperus, I think probably he's spoken to this forum in years past, now deceased, unfortunately. He calls it a tragic failure of leadership. This was swept under the rug, and he found it clear down in 1974, and you can see where it was printed in Spectrum. Why was it a tragic example of poor leadership? Because the problem got worse and worse and worse. Let's consider it a physical problem. The time to deal with a problem is when it just begins. Don't put it off. It gets worse and worse the more you neglect it. So that's why Mulares Couperus uses these words. All right, we move next to a man I'm sure has spoken to this forum also, Jack Provencher, also unfortunately now dead. And here I must confess, if you will look over at the footnote on 28, that is a very unfortunate and significant footnote. I don't know, I'm sorry to use a big word, the provenance of this paper. I ran onto this paper in the archives at Loma Linda, and by provenance it means I don't know where it was given or the date. I know it was given by Jack Provencher. And my guess is somebody transcribed some statements of him from a Sabbath school class. Does anyone know the background of this? I would very much appreciate it. This is poor librarianship, I'm sure. John, right, where are you? Shouldn't have done this. But there it is, without the deeds of hiding. Now, I knew Jack Provencher. He and I worked together in a number of committees, and I respect him highly. He's unfortunately not dead, too. And this sounds like him, but that's all I can say in defense of using these. And let's look at a few of his comments here. Well, I don't know what to read here. Starting in that second paragraph right under Jack Provencher speaks out. Maybe that's the one to look at. Well, at the bottom of the page, he added to ensure complete understanding. To misuse a gift of God, and thus the power of God, for self-serving ends is to take his name in vain. He's talking about the GC leadership. This is pretty rough. And those who knew Jack well could see the firm set of his jaw and the unflinching direct gaze that would have accompanied such words if they had been spoken in his famous Loma Linda Sabbath School class. He would not have raised his voice nor clenched the fist. He did not need cheap rhetorical devices to seize your attention. Frankly, your reaction would well have been a silent prayer of thanks that those devastating words had not been directed at you. So read them at your leisure. And then he had more stern words here below it also. So, now we come to another man who was president, I think, of Southwestern Adventist College at the time he did his research, no longer in the church or no longer employed by the church. Professor Donald McAdams, who had a fine PhD in American history from Duke University, and began to do some research of his own. But what I'm interested in here first is an article that he wrote for Spectrum reviewing some problems related to our topic. And middle of that first paragraph, page 29. In 1970, Adventist scholars, the earliest such a group could be identified, began for the first time to examine critically her, Ellen White's, writings and to share their conclusions with the community of Adventist intellectuals, another surprising community. Everything in brackets is my comment. McAdams stated in an excellent article published in 1980. So he says, the 1970s introduced a new era in the study of Ellen White. He says a number of significant books had been printed about her, including the Nickel book that we've talked about. But he said these were apologetic literature. And we'll say more about apologetics later on. That means defense. It doesn't mean to apologize for something you've done wrong, to defend an institution, a church, and so on. And he said, now, notice on page 30, the scholarship of the 1970s had a different origin and purpose, not apologetics. It was a series of outstanding articles that started with a bang in the autumn 1970 Spectrum, which I saved. These are blockbuster issues. They were motivated not to tear down, but to understand Ellen White. They insisted upon objective scholarship and a critical examination of sources. That's where we are now. This has changed. And I should have prefaced my comments by saying, I'm not mad at anybody. I haven't been mistreated. I simply have tried in my research to understand my church, my prophet. I've tried to understand. That's all. I'm not a muckraker. I've been called that, but I'm not. I'm simply trying to better understand my church. It doesn't belong to the White Estate. It doesn't belong to the GC. It's my church. It's your church. And that's my position I should have made clear before. Okay. And out of this, of course, first he discusses Ron Numbers, a personal friend of mine, an outstanding scholar, a world-class scholar who has gone on to very high esteem and acclaim since we summarily ran him out of Loma Linda University. And you know him quite well, I think, so perhaps we don't need to stop long here. But notice here on page 31 that Spectrum followed up Ron Numbers' publication of his books, not by an Adventist press. What was it? Who was published it? Harper and Row, I think, or some major press. 2 reviews that were printed in Spectrum in 1977. One by Fawn Brody, and I don't think Spectrum has ever been forgiven for printing that one. Have they? I don't think so. Fawn Brody came to La Sierra one time to give a presentation. A brilliant woman, historian from UCLA. A psycho-historian. She wasn't psycho. She was a psycho-historian. And she had been thrown out of the Mormon Church for writing a very good biography of Joseph Smith, the great hero of the Mormon Church. Her parents, her father was a very high bishop in the Mormon Church. Didn't help her. She was thrown out. Not going to allow this sort of thing. She came to La Sierra to talk and was a very charming lady and fascinating to listen to her talk. And you notice what Spectrum said, what they quote her analysis in this shocking article. Ellen White's visions, she asserted, were a form of self-hypnosis springing from the psychic conflicts of her repressed sexuality. Now imagine that one flying. Well, a fascinating woman, that's her position. She's a psychohistorian. And here's something that should cause great rejoicing. I'm sure it has, ever since. After the meeting was over, just talking casually with the group, she said her ambition was to write next on her list a good psychobiography of Ellen Gould Harmon White. She's a fascinating woman. I wanted to do that. She died of cancer within a year, I think, after that. No more comments. The second is an article by Ernest R. Sandine, and I can let you read that one. Nice article. Then we come to McAdams' own contribution, 244-page typescript entitled Ellen G. White and the Protestant Historians, the evidence from an unpublished manuscript on John Huss. He sent it off to the White Estate requesting their criticism. As far as I know, he never got it back. I haven't seen it. Has anyone seen it published? I think it went into the Great Black Hole there or something. I think it disappeared. Fine scholarship. Never been printed to the best of my knowledge. Next we go through, and these are just people who have raised issues on plagiarism and a brief statement about what they did or what happened. And Walter Ray, you probably know. He had a feeling, and I wish he were here to tell us where this began. A suspicion began to develop that she was not being candid and open in citing her sources. And so he voiced that criticism, that question, and was told he was out of line, and he persisted. And there's where the problem began. He first was interested in prophets and kings, and later on Desire of Ages. And out of this frustration, when no one would help him, and they said, you must be quiet, don't talk this way, repression, he eventually, in his frustration, wrote a book called The White Lie. Probably most of you have not read it. It's not a great book. He shouldn't have written it. There was no cause for it ever to be written. I have a statement, my words. I think this is an unfortunate book. It never should have happened if we'd had better sense in the leadership, but maybe criticism is easy. The book is there, and he's still doing work. He called me up recently and congratulated me on my research. I was overwhelmed. And I said, now, why are you congratulating me, Walter? He was my pastor once. And he said, because you stay in the middle of the road. You're balanced and you're fair. You look at all sides. So he knew he had slipped. Walter Specht and Raymond Cottrell, I think I'll just skip them because they didn't make significant contributions, although I must say about Walter Specht, he was one of my teachers and a fine one. So we'll let those go by. Now we come to a big one. Fred Veltman. Charges of literary dependency, and I'm just using Plagiarism by Ellen White, persisted about Desire of Ages, and the General Conference then made, I think, a very wise decision. They said, we will devote money to finance an Adventist scholar leader and his staff to investigate in great detail Desire of Ages for literary dependency, i.e. plagiarism. I have never met him. The testimony about him at PUC is of the very highest order. He was chair of their religion department. His academic credentials are outstanding. So I have no question that I've ever picked up about his qualifications. And here are his words, if you want to read them, on the confrontation that faced him on page 35 there. This was a staggering problem. And what he was looking for, he explains, was when the key code symbols appear in her writings. Now, they don't appear in Desire of Ages, but in other of her writings, quite commonly, I saw or I was shown. What does that really mean? And how does that relate to Desire of Ages and her inspiration? So that was the essence of what he had to look for. And he made it clear, notice, that Ellen White practically never commented on her sources. Rather, she made, and this is a quote from Veltman, a number of statements leading the reader to believe she did not use sources of any kind. One might reasonably argue that the mindset of the typical Adventist reader of her writing, Veltman, at least until recently, could be expressed in a long statement made by her husband James in 1880, the year before his death. And at your leisure, you should read that statement at the top of 37 by James White, which makes it absolutely clear. This is her husband and very influential man in her life and work. That I think is perfectly clear. So let's look at Veltman in a little more detail here. His work is about 900 pages long. I brought 100 pages with me in case there's any time to discuss them. Marvelously carefully worked out, scholarly work. But not many church members are going to read 900 pages, are they? The attention span today in the country, what is it, about 15 seconds I read? Like that? So they're not going to read 900 pages. He has a summary of 100 pages, which I read through again last night, and it's a marvel of concision and of accuracy, of readability, and I recommend that. Question comes, where are you going to get it? I don't know where you're going to get a copy. Somebody slipped me a copy. I don't know where they got it from. It's available at the Heritage Room in La Sierra and Loma Linda. I don't think it's ever been available in the ABCs, has it? Have you seen it for sale, the Veltman Report? Son, I don't think it would make much money, but it's too bad you can't have a look at it. You paid the money for the 8 years of work they spent with tithe money. I see, now we're over to page 37. Are we going to make it by, we better hurry. The primary concern of this research has been to discover the nature and extent of Ellen White's use of sources and secretaries, middle of page 37, in her writing on the life of Christ, particularly the writing of Desire of Ages. And he meets that objective in a marvelous, balanced way, in my opinion. Notice two things. Her bookmakers is the last part. He deals with that very fairly, nicely. And then her sources, that is, other books that she used. If we have time, we'll talk about some of that a bit. Then he's still worried that nobody's going to read 100 pages. So he makes a postscript of 10 pages. And you can read that. I brought that along also. So the grand total I see is 958 pages. And I must explain a bit about the structure of the book and the study. Desire of Ages has 87 chapters in it. I, in the past, have read Desire of Ages through more than once. I didn't read it through as a scholar or critic or anything. I had it as an assignment and life and teaching and so forth. I've taught those courses in the academy. I did not read it with a sharp focus like he had to. So I greatly appreciate the quality of the work he did. He and his committee, and I'm right here, I might say I'm impressed greatly by his committee. When I learned who his chief assistant was, I said, I have no doubts about it. Any of you who know Paul Stauffer, Professor Dr. Paul Stauffer, that's his chief assistant, now retired at PUC, Dean of the Graduate School at Loma Linda for many years. And you could not have a better assistant than that man. He's a real scholar, Harvard PhD, in case that means anything to you. So they ask 14 basic questions, and I'll deal with 2 or 3 of them very briefly, and you can read them all. He doesn't cover up anything. About 15 randomly selected chapters. Now, there are 87, and he said, he talks about time constraints. And he put in 8 years, and they said, no more money. They said, we're not through. Well, we're sorry. We run out of money. So time constraints were real to do this very thorough sort of work. So they had to limit it, they knew it, and this is the way they selected these randomly selected chapters. Now, I'm not a statistician. I found statistics a very tough subject when I was taking it. Any statisticians here can help me out? Nobody volunteers. Well, this is the way they decided to do it. To arrange all 87 chapters in their length. Long, medium, and short. 3 groups. 3 evenly matched groups in numbers. To take 5 randomly selected. He didn't say whether they cast lots, dice, drew straws, or what. Randomly selected 5 of those 3 groups, 5 from each, and concentrate on those. Now, is that accurate, scientific, random selection? It's all right with me, but I don't know what the flaws are. Maybe you let a computer do it now. Not sure. They asked 14 questions of these 15 different chapters. And he lists the chapters if you want to look at them. The first question, to give you a sample, do we have primary, notice italics, primary source material for the Ellen White text? Text means the original manuscript of Desire of Ages. And what they mean by primary text is written in her handwriting. That's a primary source. First hand, participant, witness, creator. That make sense? The answer was a resounding 0. Now, if you had told me that about my dissertation topic, that there were 0 primary sources, I could never have gotten it approved. Because I would say no secondary. Secondary, meaning there were no eyewitnesses or participants who wrote about this. Well, you can't do it. Research. So this was a horrendous shock when they discovered that there was nothing in Ellen White's handwriting in the way of a manuscript for Desire of Ages. If you think a little bit, you can see what the problems would be. They had to go back to her journal, to her diary, to her letters, and find things in her handwriting that related to it. So he discusses that. If you find it interesting, it is a fundamental problem here. Question number 5, to give you a sample. What is the nature of the dependency of the Desire of Ages text on literary sources? In other words, what did she borrow from others without giving him credit? And you're right in the middle of the pages. Mine is underlined in bright purple ink here. I won't miss it with a big old asterisk. On an average, we may say that 31.4% of the Desire of Ages text is dependent to some extent on literary sources. In other words, plagiarized without credit. 31.4 after 8 years. That's shocking. Then question 10. What sources were used by Ellen White in the production of her articles, letters, and manuscripts on the life of Christ? And they picked out the three most common, and we already knew from another project that William Hanna would be number one, then Daniel March and John Harris. All right, we move on. Veltman's conclusions. Maybe we'll make it by 4:30. Okay. I haven't even had a swig of my patented Arrowhead spring water yet, so I may hold out. Here are his conclusions. Now remember, this is a minister of the gospel, lifelong minister of the gospel, chairman of the religion department at PUC, and well-qualified, well-established Adventist. Now, he has to make conclusions. Statement number 1. Stark, stripped down, brutally simple. My words. Ellen White used his literary sources when writing The Desire of Ages. And I make some comments and I won't read those. This is it, in just so many words. Then, so, as I say, no excuse for hardened apologists to miss the brutal truth. He elaborated in a paragraph below. You can read that. And what do we have here? As I make a statement at the bottom, the old minimalist defense, she only borrowed a little, is gone. No longer. That's what that means. Just a little bit. Minimalist defense. That's gone. So there's number 1 from Zolman here. Statement number 2, the bottom of page 40. I have many things I'd like to read, but you can read them. That's what it's a nice thing about the way Jim is doing this now. You have the document, so you don't have to take your memory on these things. You can say, what did he say? Did he say that stupid thing? And you can look on page 40, and there I said it. So don't waste your time reading. There it is. Statement number 2. The content of Ellen White's commentary on the life and ministry of Christ, The Desire of Ages, is for the most part derived, taken from others, rather than original, in case you missed it first time around. Thank you, Brother Veltman. And to read more comments about it. Now, something that bothered him tremendously, bothered me also, and I want your help to try to resolve, appears here on page 41. Her claims for the heavenly origin of her content is at the crux of the source problem. How are we to understand what she meant by such expressions when it is so obvious that she used contemporary sources written by authors who did not claim such heavenly origins for their work? Well, those are tough ones here. All right, over to page 42. In here, page 41 and 42 is a fascinating section where he says, Adventists have often used Desire of Ages to provide facts not in the Bible, extra canonical information. And read that and you'll see it's not right. You won't find them in Desire of Ages. It's just mind-boggling to see that develop. You cannot use it in that way. Okay, finally we're down to point 5 at the bottom of 42. Ellen White's literary assistants, particularly Marion Davis, are responsible for the published form of The Desire of Ages. And here we come into the role of her secretaries or bookmakers, and included in that, most tragically of all, and I have a research project going for her, so I must mention, is poor Fanny Bolton. I say poor, it's just tragic, it's uncalled for, it's disgusting, the way Fanny Bolton was treated. And sometime maybe if you look over my manuscript on Fanny Bolton, I can be Fanny. I don't know. It's in progress now. Yeah, find an error. Yes. There are not many proofreaders as good as you are, Jim, or maybe Averill found it. Yeah. So much for these. You can read his. The role of the bookmakers was considerable. And that's all right, to hire someone to help you make a book. That's all right. You can hire a ghost writer also, and I deal with that later on. Well, the postscript. And in the postscript, he deals, this is Veltman, with a question at the bottom of 44, which I simply am unable to rationalize at all. He says he's not convinced that Ellen White committed plagiarism. I think he's quibbling with definitions of words, relating them to certain times, and so forth. I'm obviously not reading him closely or correctly here. It looks to me like Fred Veltman every day of the 8 years was faced with this issue. If plagiarism means what he said it meant to him. All right. The middle of page 45. This hit him very hard, and I understand he brings this up at every presentation. He has not been able to reconcile or make peace with this part of his investigation. Let's look at that first full paragraph. Another question often raised in connection with the plagiarism issue, Elder Veltman declared, has to do with Ellen White's denial, consistent denial, of literary borrowing. And with that penetrating question, the scene shifted drastically to the extremely significant moral and ethical domain. I think you follow me on that one. Her response was masterful, but not at all satisfactory. So then he picks this up. At the bottom of the page, if Ellen White's rejection of wrongdoing by having consistently denied borrowing from others without attribution, without giving credit, is to be accepted, then there are no absolutes to which we can appeal. And situation ethics rules supreme, and morality is entirely relative. Those are my words. Deal with them as you want. Okay. He claims that, let's skip it. The paragraph beginning, however, on page 46. I have not reached my peace with this at all. I don't understand what he's telling me. He did shockingly admit that, quote, this is Spellman, along with nearly every other Adventist associate in biblical studies, I was not troubled by the discoveries over Ellen White's use of sources, end of quote. Inspiration, to my way of thinking, is not dependent upon originality. All right? Is it not also dependent upon ordinary standards of honesty and fairness? My question. But anyway, maybe you can help me out with that one. Now we turn to, yes, we'll make it, another phase. As far as I'm concerned, I repeat what I probably passed over too rapidly. The issue of plagiarism, no matter how you want to define it, is no longer an issue with me. It's a closed book. It's a finished case. It's now a matter of degree. I'm interested in some certain books that are attractive to me, where they came from. It's an academic interest. It's not an interest that would have an impact upon what we're talking about at all today. This has been concluded, in my opinion. Plagiarism, or literary indebtedness, or borrowing without it, whatever you want to call it, that's a closed book. It's finished. We don't need any more evidence, although we're going to get some more. And when the word got out, this being recorded, all right, when the word got out some way that I was going to talk on this, I have received 3 shipments of manuscripts, one 400, one 600, one 800 pages long. People are not going to stop their investigation of this topic. They're rather unreadable, but that's all right. So I don't know where we're going to go. Now we're shifting then to another area. I think, and I was heavily convinced by a paper by Professor James W. Walters, ethicist at Lowell. Is Jim here by any chance today? I'm going to make some comments about him, and I told him I would, but he didn't show up. He trusts me, I guess. The article appeared in the March-April 1998 issue of Adventist Today. And this was its title, which caught my attention. Ellen G. White and Truth-Telling, an Ethical Analysis of Literary Dependency. I don't know that anybody reacted to that. I did, but I never wrote to anyone or called anyone. It was reprinted in March-April 2002, and at the end of the article reprint, there was this editorial note. And again, I would like some illumination. As this article illustrates, we refuse to hide from the truth or run from the church. Now, what do you make out of that? That's an Adventist Today. I've subscribed since the first issue. I don't understand what has happened here.
Maybe we should ask the publisher.
Is the publisher here? What happened? Why that strong statement?
Doesn't have an answer at the moment.
At the moment, okay, all right, that's okay. So I'll just have to relax and wait for a resolution later on. But I hope, can you tell me that somebody noticed this? It did have an impact? Okay. Okay, all right. Good. I feel better. All right. Now I'm going to comment on the article as I read it, and I had a problem, or several problems. It was not really a transcript of a manuscript by Jim Walters. I couldn't tell, and then this big word, provenance, the background for this, whether it was a speech given, or an article, or an interview, or what, because it was placed in the third person, Jim Walters so-and-so. It was paraphrased, and it was heavily summarized. So finally I said, what are you worrying about this for? Pick up the telephone, Loma Linda's close by, and call over there. And Jim said, I'll send you one by fax right off. Well, I was gone away on another research trip. Didn't get back in time to find it, to put that in the original manuscript. It was already a monster out of size, out of limit. So you will find my reactions to the fax copy appearing in notes, 52, 3, and 4 along there. So I'm confessing now to not being entirely fair in this manuscript to the intent of Jim Walters, but I hope he rewrites and updates this article and prints it again. That's my encouragement from this, all right? Here we go. Walters challenged recent approaches to the critically important problem area of Ellen G. White's inspiration and charges of plagiarism in her extensive writing. Now, it's reported by James Sterling, a good friend of mine, and I assume this is very nicely, accurately done, but I've stated my problems here. So over to page 50. There is this quibble, and I'm sure it wasn't necessary. I'm sure Jim knows this. He talks about the sad plight of Fanny Bolton. Well, I agree with him on this, but then I say perhaps he didn't realize this, that Ellen White was in her own rights to a considerable degree, if not entirely, to control the people she hired. Fanny Bolton was hired. And if Fanny Bolton didn't like the conditions of her hiring, she should have left. You can hire a ghostwriter, you can hire an editor, you can hire anybody you want to. When the book is finished, your name goes on it, and you don't have to give credit to those who assisted you. Now, I admit, it would have been very nice, Sister White, if you had given more credit to these people. It would have been nicer. But legally, maybe even morally, ethically, I'm not sure. No, that little quibble there. This was Ellen White's writing, and she had the help from these people. Now, if Fanny Bolton had discovered that Ellen White had used some of her articles in which Fanny had quoted material from a writer and given them credit, and that Ellen White had knocked out the credit part and quoted it as if she had written it, then that is entirely wrong. That is entirely wrong. So we'll make that clear. Well, he goes on here, and this is this very strong reasoning. Ellen White was not a scofflaw. Okay. Her first allegiance, however, was to her divinely founded church and to her prophetic role in it. His elaboration of this summary statement was startling. I read every word. Strict truth-telling was important for general Christian discipleship. Seek. But this restriction seemingly intended only for a lesser breed, so these are my words, must not be allowed to inhibit Sister White in exercising her critically important role as God's special messenger and in producing the, quote, needed volumes of divinely inspired messages. Now we're back to Jim Walters, or still with Jim Walters. She was obviously self-conscious, defensive, and regrettably deceptive. That seek means that's the way it appears. I know what I'm writing here. It's just a little editorial device. About her source dependence, read Plagiarism. Walters reluctantly concluded. But if she didn't, now here is the clincher. If she didn't do these things, use her sources, and she had difficulty writing a coherent paragraph without them, my comment, how could she be true to her prophetic writing role, a role she saw as so crucial? Question mark, end of Jim Walters' statement. My comment, of course, we know her solution was to this soul-wrenching dilemma, was to begin a vast, elaborate, and masterful undertaking of plagiarism. What she termed this process in her own mind, if indeed she ever gave it any systematic thought, has been kept from us. What her extremely limited formal education had denied her was any decent knowledge about world history and philosophy, in which she would have easily discovered a standard solution for her dilemma. The elect are above the law. She acted like a divine right monarch in history. The laws are for somebody else, or at least some modern version of benefit of clergy. Or she was following Acts 25:29. We ought to obey God rather than men. Her orders came from a higher source than human laws. Very telling. Now, Walters indicates that Ellen White was 57 years of age when accusations of source indebtedness, plagiarism, were first made. That is, it's about 1895. And his words, surely she was conscious of what she was doing in her literary work. So he's saying it wasn't accidental, it wasn't absent-mindedness, it wasn't naivete, it wasn't ignorance. She knew what she was doing. It's purposeful, deliberate. Notice in the brackets I say Veltman shows 1887, Ken Wright. And notice also what I added, James White died in 1881. You want to make a thesis? And Jim will invite you back to present it. When James White died, the source of control over her excessive use of plagiarism disappeared. He was the governor. Okay, you want to try to develop that? I don't know if I'll get around to it, so you can have it. Give me a footnote credit for suggesting. I think something desperately needed disappeared with James White when he died in 1881. You might look at the Lucinda Hall letters if you're interested. They're up in Loma Linda, but there's severe restrictions on their use. So be careful. Ask what the restrictions are before you waste your time. Okay. He says, again, these are very well put phrases. Her, Ellen White's, early paraphrasing may have begun quite innocently. What third grader would have had any instruction in the intricacies of proper source attribution? That's my question. Third grade education at a very poor level. When later accusations arose, she was overtly confronted with the use of deception. So being an intelligent, mature, and churchly wise woman, you see where the quotes are, who surely was conscious of what she was doing in her literary work, her obvious decision must have come quite effortlessly, my words. He summed it up in 3 cogent sentences. top of page 52. Here's Jim Walters at his best. Her earlier and simpler options had vanished. Should she admit source dependence and thus thwart the finishing of God's work? Horrendous decision. And thus thwart the finishing of God's work, a work she closely identified with herself? See, unthinkable. Evidently, the compelling end of finishing God's work justified the increasingly dubious means. The end, noble, justified by the questionable means. That's Jesuitical thinking or Machiavellian thinking. Sorry about the term, but they're just standard interpretation. So, here we go. After that simple rationalization, if that's what you want to call it, it would have become increasingly easy to repeat the process when well-written material again fortuitously appeared. She was a voracious reader, saw something well-written, use it. You see, difficult to resist. Now, a man named David Plotz, I know nothing about him. I just ran onto this article, and where did I find it? In Virginia Quarterly Review, and I give the reference if you want the whole article. He says, this is the way we describe that sort of slippery slope. 1, plagiarism is careless. 2 is the pattern. 4 or 5 or more is pathology. That's not nice, is it? Not nice. Nice. Well, his conclusions, Jim does his very best to be kind, considerate, balanced. Let's look at one of his statements rather than my assertion about it on page 53. Ellen White's deceptive literary practices must not be countenanced. What does that mean? Permitted. Well, what are we going to do about it now? There's our big question. Although they can be comprehended. See, he's tried to explain how they happen. They happen. But we can't countenance this sort of thing. Unless Ellen White is seen as totally self-deluded. Notice, totally self-deluded. Her literary practices do detract from her personal integrity. However, Walters does not believe they destroy it. See the paraphrase there, and you can get his own words in this article. And it's summarized again below that. He ends with a beautiful paragraph of appreciation for her, and I think it's a marvelous statement, and I subscribe to it also. If I haven't said this before, she's the most important person in the Adventist Church. It's history. No question about it at all. We're not dealing with that sort of thing, and he does a nice concluding paragraph here. And again, I hope it's reprinted, redone, re-edited. I'm sure he has new thoughts, new developments on it. Well, we're very close to stopping time. I have a very dubious, extremely dubious section at the end we can just skip. I call it charting a new course. What do we do now? Where do we go? And it's probably you won't receive it well, but I'm saying, what do you do? It's your responsibility now. But do you want to break now? And do you want me to just briefly look at this? Okay, let me just briefly look at what I suggest. I start with a statement that we must remember, I'm telling myself, something that may not be comprehensible to all of you, that we're dealing with history. We're dealing with the past. We can't call Ellen White in here and question her, or James White, or anybody. They're gone. What do we have? Written records, or maybe a little hearsay. We don't have recordings, we don't have motion pictures, so we have written records. That's what historians deal with. And written records can be very tricky and difficult and maddening to deal with. And people can be dishonest in written records. I know how shocked I was in graduate school when a very esteemed professor looked us in the eye and said, fellows, and there were no girls in a graduate history course, remember, autobiographies and memoirs are just another form of fiction. I said, horrors, what a terrible thing to say. And he repeated it and stared us each in the eye. I have come to understand what he meant. Most of us, not you, I find it very difficult to be honest in telling my life story. I doctor it up. I'm a doctor, that's a bad word. I embellish it. I embellish things. I divert. You wouldn't do that, of course. You wouldn't do that. Or you can go the other extreme, like one famous man, Rousseau, and some people that come around to my church and tell the audience how bad they were. I was the worst of this, that, and God saved me. That's the other extreme. Rousseau, you couldn't believe anything he said. He was just trying to make a horrible ogre out of himself. I don't know, he was mentally ill. Anyway, history is a difficult subject. You read that paragraph. You may not like it. I don't like it myself. Now, the next thing we have to do to be fair to her, and this is almost impossible, we have to transport ourselves back. And this isn't Ouija board stuff. This is something you have to do. Transport ourselves back mentally, imaginatively, to her day, to her time, and try to get inside her mind. That sounds terrible, doesn't it? We try to understand what it was like to her to have these things happen. And first we have to try to understand what it was like to live in 1827 in Maine. And that means so much reading you don't want to start. When you begin to read, and may I tell one short story? The classic example of what has to be done to be fair to someone in the past is illustrated by Dr. Godfrey Trigby Anderson, president of Loma Linda University, a fine historian, University of Chicago, PhD. In a small group, he joined the history faculty after they unwisely let him go as president of Loma Linda. Very bad decision, but great for us. And in a small group talking one day, he told this story. He was trying to impress upon students there was no limit to the amount of background reading they had to do to be competent to evaluate any subject. He said, I'm working on Puritanism, University of Chicago, PhD program. He was also, I think, president of Atlantic Union College at the time. Reading, everything. Original sources, sermons, letters, so forth, primary doctrine. He woke up one morning, said to his wife, "Wife, I'm a Puritan." She leaped out of bed and screamed, "You're sick, Trigby, you're sick." She didn't understand at all. We all understood. He had reached that magic level where he could understand a Puritan in the past. That's what he meant. I'm not Ellen White. I don't understand her yet. I guess I don't have a chance. I'm urging, do you know of any good biography written by an Adventist woman? Why haven't we had a biography by an Adventist professional scholar about Ellen White? Who would know better how to interpret a woman than a specialist in 19th century history, an Adventist woman scholar? Where are they? Why haven't they written a book? You see, that's the sort of thing we need, the insight that can be gained by transporting yourself back. It sounds like mysticism, doesn't it? But it has to be done. And I think, even though some of you look doubtful, I'll check into a psychiatric ward later on and see. But it has to be done. And it isn't spooky at all. It's trying to understand. Okay. And we'll have to skip this.